Ooh. So, I'm looking at Jonathan Burris again. Wasn't really feeling it, but then, Nick Sayers encouraged me to kind of keep up with him because somebody's got to. So, this is kind of a speech he gave on hermeneutics. Um, Now, this is going to be a series, so some of the stuff I'm just going to skip past and then deal with it later. But he was talking about the law of first mention. Now, he's like, well, there shouldn't be a law of first mention. Um, this is, he's right that this is something that's like, kind of particular to the independent Baptist scene and their colleges and stuff. So, because I didn't go to one of those, I don't know exactly where they're coming from. But yeah, I've seen a little bit of this with Gail Riplinger, and she talks about the KJV having a built-in dictionary. And I think, where I would be is I'd say it's a theory. Okay. It's an educated guess. I don't know if I'd agree to, every law first mentioned for every word. Um, but I will say that there are some verses where, within the context, you can get the gist or the basic definition of the word. Now, he was saying that this law first mentioned is saying the definition doesn't change. It's exactly the same throughout every verse. Now, I would say that, like, that's not true. But the reason it's not true is because the context will modify the words. And it's kind of funny because, you know, um, Burris will, live and die on this translation of Daniel chapter 3, where Nebuchadnezzar, according to him, he says that Nebuchadnezzar said that, the deity of Christ, the theophany, the Christophany, okay, that him seeing the Spirit of Christ, basically, he said that looks like the Son of God's, okay? So he's like, Jesus, the Son of God's. It could be just translated Jesus, the Son of God. But, it's like, no, the word is the word. But in this speech, now he's kind of like modified a little bit, and it's like, well, no, you can't just haul off and use words dictionary. You have to get the context. I'm like, well, duh. Welcome to our side. I think that Burris is trying to walk it back a little bit. I think that basically he's still wanting to come off as a conservative, mention the fact that he's like a Baptist. So, yeah, he's probably just not wanting to lose his audience. I think he still wants some independent Baptists to follow him. So, regardless, that's my theory. Okay, it's not a law. But he mentions some other things. He says that he holds to a consistent literal hermeneutic. Or let's see here. No, consistent historical grammatical hermeneutic. That's great. That's my preference. I think there's other hermeneutical principles. So since he's liking himself to be a Calvinist, I do actually agree with Calvinists on the issue of having a regular principle. I think what I do is probably a little bit more defined. So there's a difference between Presbyterian and Baptist on the regular principle, like among even the hardcore Baptist Calvinists and Presbyterian Calvinists. Presbyterians will say they have a rule called necessary inference, whereas Baptists just say you don't add to it. Um, I think that as far as when we're talking about the meaning of the text, that you don't add to the meaning of the text. And there are implications of the text. Generally, that's kind of my thing is that, you have a meaning that you're looking for, that the author has a meaning in mind to the text. And then you can glean out some implications to that text. So, for instance, thou shalt not commit adultery. And Jesus says, if a man looks on a woman with lust, he has committed adultery in his heart. And what's that? That's an implication of the law, thou shalt not commit adultery. Okay, so if you're looking with lust in your heart when you got adultery in your heart, then you committed adultery in your heart. So, meaning and implications, but not going past that first implication. If you go past that, if you got implications on top of your implications, that's a tradition, but that's not what the scripture is about. Now, so one minute he's got himself committed to that. I don't believe he's consistent. I believe that he has some previous beliefs that will probably fall apart as long as he's going in this direction. And so, the historical grammatical hermeneutic, that's going to fall apart. You could already see it because in the video, he says, like, some people prefer a Christocentric hermeneutic, and, there's good guys on both sides. There's nothing wrong with either approach. Well, no, the approaches do conflict. Essentially, with a Christocentric hermeneutic, what you're really going for is making things a little bit more figurative in your interpretation, and usually pointing out something pious like the deity of Christ or Jesus the Messiah or something there. And basically cutting all the grooves and curves off and just making a simple philosophy. And that's really what it becomes because it's not really a good exposition at that point. Um, if something is talking about Christ, I think it should be obvious. And I think that if you can plainly read it and see that it's pointing to Jesus, great. But if it's something that just doesn't fit what you feel, then no, you don't have a right to just simply um, replace that and then just say Jesus, Jesus, yay, yay, yay. What was it? Anyway, so he's already kind of conflicting his views. Um, and, I think an evidence of that is that he was sitting there talking about, he was anathematizing dispensationalism in a previous episode, and he said that even the C.I. Scofield has multiple gospels and he's a heretic and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, this is one of the guys who's, one of the fundamentals, okay? This is, one of the most well known fundamentalists in the world, which means that he accepts these orthodox principles. And, he's just kind of slashing right through. So, a principle, for instance, Israel. There's a little over 60 prophecies about the return of Israel. And they've not fulfilled everything. They've not come back to Christ yet. But that's an easy possibility at this point. There's plenty of people who are wanting to witness the Jews or have witnessed the Jews or Christians who are living in Israel. So, that could easily happen in the future. And that's kind of one of those things we look forward to. But a lot of guys, Christocentric, a lot of them will do replacement theology. And that's something popular with his Reformed brethren. For instance, election. They want election to be a way of salvation. And when you look, first mention, at election and chosen, what you find is that these are words that are defined for the purposes of um, functionality. Okay, so the king chooses someone for this task. He's chosen those horses for that task, and he's elected these women to sew up the tabernacle um, curtains. So, basically, that kind of ruins their theology, so they're not inclined to that. And, one of the things that was kind of funny was when Jonathan Burris kind of mentioned that he's a particular Baptist. He doesn't want to get too confessional about it, but he says that he's a particular Baptist. And the only meaning that you get out of that is that there's a controversy between the General Baptist and the particular Baptist very early on in the Baptist movement. Well, the General Baptists believed in general atonement, and so God paid the sins of the whole world through Jesus Christ on the cross and his shed blood. And the particular Baptist said, no, only the believers. But when you go through the scripture, um, it literally does talk about Jesus dying for the sins of the whole world. And, I found dozens. Okay. I'd like to say I did do a thing recently on my blog, and I could probably find it and then pop it back up. It might have been like 40 different references to general atonement in the scriptures, and you don't find any to say that Jesus died for the elect only, or that Jesus didn't die for the sins of the world. He just died for, the elect or the saved or whatever. You just don't find that. So you can't really say that you're taking it literally according to the grammar. And I'll share a couple documents on that. But, Israel, they want to make Israel a word for the spiritual saints and not for literal Israel. And when you get into it, I mean, I was at a Bible college that roundly rejected it. To be fair, we did have an Old Testament professor who didn't. But generally, when you look at the context, and this is one thing the Jews are just about unanimous at. So when you look at the context, there is a literal restoration of Israel. And that's simply meant for Israel. God has chosen them for a purpose and to fulfill that purpose. So, that's kind of how that goes. But I also wanted to hit a point real quick, and that is dealing with, one of his arguments against first mention. And it's funny, he's got these weird little lines, and so he's like, now I've told you that this is bad, and then what do you say after that? Let me explain something else or whatever. But basically, he didn't really, he didn't tell you why it's bad. His thing is like, I told you this is bad, therefore you got to follow me. It's like, well, sorry, bud. I mean, maybe he's gotten a pastor sense, but like he kind of announced to the world, and this has been true for many months, that he's not pastoring anywhere. So he doesn't really have ecclesiastical authority. He's just saying this stuff, and if he doesn't make a good biblical case for it, then you can forget what he says. It don't matter. So, let's see. Yeah, he was talking about perfect, and in Genesis 6:9, it mentions that Noah was perfect. And then in the Legacy Standard Bible, it says that Noah was a righteous man or blameless. Well, still have some of those issues there. But he was saying, well, perfect here, it can't be perfect like when Jesus says, be perfect as my Father is perfect. Okay. But when you look at this stuff in context, you got to understand that there's these things we call modifiers. So as the context changes, it might change the way that you're using a word, and so that will affect the definition. But you got to remember, words don't have one definition. You look at dictionaries; they could have 2 definitions, 5, 10 definitions. So you don't really go at that, and um, so like as he's talking about, well, that's what's going on here. The Legacy Standard Bible doesn't use the word perfect. So if the law of first mention is only talking about the King James, well, guess what? Then you're not debunking it just because you find a different version has a different story. So he's presupposing modern versions, which we kind of figure that would happen. If he's presupposing these modern versions, then, if you don't agree with that, then it really doesn't affect you. Okay, well, we know that modern versions are flawed. Why? Because King James onlyists think they're flawed? Hey, guess what? Modern versions think they're flawed. Everybody thinks they're flawed. So, be that as it may. But yeah, so the first mention of perfect, let's see here. In the Legacy Standard Bible is actually Deuteronomy 32:4. So, if you can translate these to different words, then there is no point. And if that principle first mentioned is just from the reading of the King James, well, they're not really at fault for that either. Um, these new versions, they change themselves on a more massive scale. All right. Trying to see if there's anything else I wanted to talk about in this one. Oh, he didn't mention wine, and this is kind of to debunk the first mentioned principle. Well, now let's see here. In Genesis 9:21, Legacy Standard Bible says, "And he drank the wine and became drunk." Now he's saying that is wine always used for alcoholism? Well, here you have that became drunk as the modifier. So we know that wine here can refer to that, and it could have changed by the time he gets to the miracle of turning water into wine. I don't know why I'm getting hiccups while I'm talking about wine. But that wouldn't even matter anyway, because if he turned water into wine, it wouldn't have time to ferment. Because if he did turn water into wine so that people get drunk on it, well, that would break with Habakkuk. I think it's chapter 2, where it says that, God condemns people for getting people drunk. And the amount of wine they had already had, they were going to get drunk if Jesus had made alcoholic wine. So that would have been sin and disqualified him as the Messiah. That would be looking at the context to determine what's going on. That's great. All right. But yeah, so that's in both. The KJV and the LSB admit to that. Let's see here. Yeah. So, and he drank of the wine and was drunken. So, it just means that wine is capable of getting someone drunk. It didn't have anything to do with a particular alcohol level. So these are things that can be modified, and it's not an issue. But once again, I'm not necessarily saying that the first mention rule is 100%. But, there are times when this happens, and you kind of wonder, now as he's getting in new translations, that's going to warp his ability to properly do hermeneutics. All right, well, I will go ahead and catch you on the flip side.